There are moments that sell millions of records. There are moments that fill stadiums. And then, there are moments so quiet that almost nobody notices them, until years later, when people realize they were watching history being born. That morning in Memphis, thousands of people believed they had come to see Elvis Presley. None of them realized Elvis had come to find someone else. Someone the world had never heard of. Someone wearing torn shoes. Someone holding a broken guitar together with wire and hope. And before the morning was over, the king of rock and roll would kneel before that forgotten child, speak only a handful of words, and silently change the direction of a human life forever. The city of Memphis was already alive. The scent of fresh bread drifted from nearby bakeries. Old buses rumbled through crowded streets. Neon signs flickered above family-owned stores. Car radios echoed with country music while people hurried to work, never imagining that an ordinary weekday would soon become part of a story whispered for generations. Outside a neighborhood pharmacy, excitement had been building for almost an hour. Teenage girls clutched Elvis records tightly against their chests. Young boys stood on newspaper boxes just to see above the crowd. Store owners left their cash registers unattended. Taxi drivers leaned out of open windows. Even elderly couples who had never attended a single Elvis concert waited patiently beneath the morning sun. One rumor had spread through Memphis faster than the wind. Elvis Presley was inside. For most celebrities, walking out of a store lasted only seconds. For Elvis, it became an event. Every smile made tomorrow's newspaper. Every handshake became someone's greatest memory. Every autograph became a family treasure passed from one generation to another. Photographers adjusted their lenses. Reporters prepared notebooks. Security guards quietly formed a path toward the black Cadillac parked only a short distance away. His manager glanced at his watch. Everything's ready. Then, the pharmacy door opened. Conversations stopped. The crowd inhaled as one. There he was. Elvis Presley stepped into the sunlight wearing a charcoal jacket over a crisp white shirt, dark trousers perfectly pressed, polished black shoes reflecting the morning light, and his signature sunglasses resting effortlessly across his face. The paper bag in his hand suggested nothing extraordinary. He had simply come to pick up medicine. Nothing more, nothing less. The moment people saw him, the street erupted. "Elvis! Please look this way! One autograph! Just one photo!" Hands stretched toward him. Children called his name. Women wiped tears from their cheeks before he had even smiled. Security gently guided people backward. His manager opened the Cadillac door. Everything unfolded exactly as expected. Wave, smile, sign, leave. That was how every public appearance ended. Until Elvis heard a voice. Not someone calling his name, not a reporter shouting a question, not another excited fan. A song. Soft enough to disappear beneath the traffic, honest enough to silence everything else. Elvis stopped walking. One foot remained frozen halfway toward the Cadillac. His smile faded. His head turned slowly toward the opposite side of the street. At first, he couldn't even see who was singing. The performer sat beneath the faded awning of an old hardware store, partially hidden behind pedestrians crossing the sidewalk. Only fragments of the melody drifted through the morning air. Yet those few notes carried something impossible to ignore. Pain. Not the dramatic kind heard in expensive recording studios. Real pain. The kind that grows quietly inside empty kitchens, Inside homes where parents skip meals so children can eat. Inside bedrooms where dreams survive only because hope refuses to die. Elvis removed his sunglasses. His breathing slowed. Without realizing it, he had completely forgotten the crowd around him. His manager noticed immediately. "Elvis?" No answer. Security exchanged confused looks. One photographer lowered his camera. What is he looking at? Nobody knew. Then Elvis stepped away from the waiting fans. Not toward the limousine, not toward the reporters, toward the music. People instinctively followed him. Curiosity spread faster than excitement. Something unusual was happening. The famous singer crossed the busy street without saying a single word. Cars slowed. A police officer raised one hand to stop traffic. Even drivers leaned from their windows to see what could possibly be important enough for Elvis Presley to ignore hundreds of waiting admirers. As Elvis reached the opposite sidewalk, he finally saw him. The singer couldn't have been older than 12. His clothes hung loosely from his thin frame. His denim shirt had been repaired so many times that every patch told another story of survival. His trousers were faded nearly white from years of wear. His shoes barely deserved to be called shoes anymore. Tiny openings near the toes revealed worn socks that had long ago lost their color. Resting across the boy's lap was an old acoustic guitar. One side had cracked and been repaired with rough wood glue. Several tuning pegs no longer matched. The leather strap had been replaced with braided rope. Yet somehow, every note that escaped that battered instrument sounded alive. Beside him rested a dented metal cup. Inside, only a handful of coins. Not enough for comfort. Perhaps not even enough for dinner. The boy never looked up. He kept singing with his eyes closed. Every lyric felt like a prayer whispered into the wind. Elvis stood perfectly still. Then something happened inside him. Without warning, the streets of Memphis disappeared. The cheering crowd vanished. The flashing cameras dissolved into silence. Instead, he found himself remembering another small town, another poor family, another frightened little boy who once wondered whether dreams belonged only to wealthy people. He remembered tiny rooms that grew cold during winter. He remembered his mother's tired smile hiding endless worry. He remembered watching his parents pretend they weren't hungry so he could eat first. He remembered promising himself that if life ever blessed him, he would never forget what poverty sounded like. And now, standing only a few feet away, he was hearing it again. Not through words, through music. A single tear quietly formed beneath Elvis's eye. His manager had worked beside him for years. He had witnessed sold-out concerts, award ceremonies, television appearances, triumphant performances, heartbreaking disappointments. But he had almost never seen Elvis cry, especially not before speaking a single word. The final chorus echoed through the street. The boy's voice trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. When the song finally ended, he slowly opened his eyes. Without looking around, he reached toward the metal cup. 3 more coins. He smiled softly, not because it was enough, because it was more than nothing. He whispered to himself, "Mom will be happy." Then he carefully adjusted one loose guitar string and prepared to sing again. Still, he hadn't noticed who was standing before him. Elvis took one slow step forward, then another. Every person watching instinctively held their breath. What would he do? Offer money? Sign the guitar? Shake the boy's hand? Nobody guessed the truth, because nobody expected the biggest star in America to lower himself onto one knee in front of a forgotten child. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras remained frozen. Even reporters forgot to write. The boy finally lifted his head. His fingers slipped from the strings. The guitar gave one lonely note before falling silent. He blinked once. Twice. Surely. His eyes were playing tricks on him, because Elvis Presley, the man whose voice filled every radio station, whose face appeared on magazine covers across the country, whose concerts sold out before sunrise, was kneeling in front of him. The boy immediately stood, nearly dropping the guitar. I'm sorry, mister. I didn't know I was in your way. His voice shook with embarrassment. He hurried to move aside, but Elvis gently reached out and rested a hand on the old guitar. No. His voice was calm, warm, almost fatherly. You weren't in my way. A long silence followed. The entire street waited. The boy stared into Elvis's eyes, unable to understand why this legendary man was treating him as though nothing else in the world mattered. Then Elvis asked the question no reporter, no stranger, no passing pedestrian had ever cared enough to ask. What is your name, son? The boy swallowed hard. My name is Daniel. Elvis smiled. It is an honor to meet you, Daniel. No one had ever introduced himself to the boy that way. People usually walked past him, ignored him, or dropped coins without making eye contact. But this man, the most famous singer alive, had spoken his name as though it truly mattered. Daniel felt tears burning behind his eyes. Before he could stop them, one escaped, then another. He quickly looked down, ashamed. I'm sorry. Elvis gently shook his head. Never apologize for having a heart. Daniel's shoulders trembled. The crowd had become completely silent. Even the city itself seemed unwilling to interrupt. Elvis looked at the worn guitar, at the patched clothes, at the tired eyes of a child who had grown up much too quickly. Then he looked back into Daniel's face. His next words were spoken softly, yet every single person standing on that sidewalk would remember them for the rest of their lives. Daniel, I've performed in front of hundreds of thousands of people. I've heard voices inside the greatest recording studios in America. I've sung beneath lights brighter than the sun. He paused. His voice grew quieter. But what I heard from you today cannot be taught. Another silence. Then Elvis leaned slightly closer. His eyes glistened. That voice was never meant to survive on spare change. It was meant to give hope to people who have forgotten how to believe. Daniel stopped breathing. Around them, grown men quietly wiped away tears. Mothers hugged their children tighter. Photographers lowered their cameras. Because deep inside, everyone understood. This was no longer a meeting between a superstar and a poor child. It was the exact moment one dream recognized another. And before this unforgettable morning came to an end, Elvis Presley would ask Daniel one question. A question that neither of them could possibly answer yet, but whose answer would change both of their lives forever. This ending creates a strong cliffhanger for part 2, while deepening the emotional connection and setting up the boy's backstory and Elvis's life-changing decision. The street remained completely silent. Nobody rushed toward Elvis anymore. Nobody shouted for an autograph. Nobody even remembered the cameras. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the unlikely scene before them. The king of rock and roll was still kneeling beside a boy whom the world had ignored only minutes earlier. Elvis looked into Daniel's frightened eyes. Then he asked quietly, "Daniel, who taught you to sing like that?" The boy lowered his head. For several long seconds he couldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely louder than a whisper. "No one." Elvis frowned gently. "No one?" Daniel slowly shook his head. "My mama used to hum old church songs while she cooked. After she became sick, she couldn't sing anymore. So I kept singing them for her." A heavy silence settled over the crowd. Even the reporters stopped writing. Daniel looked down at the cracked guitar. "My daddy passed away when I was little. I don't remember much about him. But Mama always told me," he forced a smile through trembling lips, "that music was the only thing nobody could ever steal from us." Elvis felt a knot tighten in his chest. Those words struck him harder than any applause ever had, because he knew exactly what it meant to grow up with almost nothing. He remembered nights when hope was the only thing his family still possessed. He remembered praying for opportunities that seemed impossible. He slowly asked, "Do you come here every day?" Daniel nodded. "Every morning. And every afternoon. And sometimes until it gets dark. People are kinder after sunset." Elvis glanced toward the small metal cup. There were only a few coins inside. He quietly asked, "How much do you usually earn?" Daniel hesitated. "It depends. Some days enough for bread. Some days, nothing. And when it rains," he smiled sadly, "nobody stops." Elvis looked away for a moment. His manager had never seen that expression before. It wasn't pity. It was heartbreak. "What happens if you don't earn enough?" Daniel answered without self-pity. "We drink water." "Mama tells me tomorrow will be better." Those simple words shattered whatever composure Elvis still had. He removed his sunglasses completely. His eyes were wet. The crowd noticed. Many of them began wiping away tears as well. One elderly woman quietly covered her mouth. A father wrapped his arm around his young son. No one expected a child to speak about hunger so calmly. Elvis took a slow breath. "Daniel, can I meet your mother?" The boy looked surprised. "You want to meet her?" "I do." Daniel hesitated. "Our house isn't very nice." Elvis smiled warmly. "I'm not looking for a nice house. I'm looking for a wonderful mother." For the first time that morning, Daniel laughed. It was small. It was nervous. But it was real. The crowd smiled with him. Elvis stood and turned toward his manager. "Cancel everything this afternoon." The manager blinked. "Everything?" "Every meeting. Every interview. The recording session. The dinner. All of it." The manager stared in disbelief. "Elvis, those appointments have been scheduled for months." Elvis answered without hesitation. "They can wait. This family has already waited long enough." No one argued again. Minutes later, Elvis climbed into his Cadillac, but instead of sitting in the back seat alone, he opened the passenger door. He looked at Daniel. "Come with me." The boy froze. "Me?" "Yes. I'd like you to show me where home is." Daniel looked at the crowd, then at his worn clothes, then back at Elvis. "I've never ridden in a Cadillac." Elvis grinned. "Neither had I, until somebody gave me a chance." Daniel carefully climbed inside, still holding the broken guitar against his chest. As the Cadillac slowly pulled away, hundreds of people remained standing on the sidewalk. Nobody spoke. Some smiled, others cried. They all sensed they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not because Elvis had helped someone, but because he had treated a forgotten child with dignity before offering him anything else. The drive across Memphis grew quieter. Daniel looked out the window, amazed by neighborhoods he had only ever walked past. Finally he spoke. "Mr. Presley." "You really listened." Elvis looked at him. "Of course I listened." Daniel swallowed. "Most people only hear me. They never actually listen." Elvis rested one hand gently on the dashboard. "Daniel, the world is full of noise, but every once in a while, you hear a voice that comes straight from the heart. I heard yours." Daniel stared out the window, fighting back tears. Nearly 30 minutes later, the Cadillac turned onto a narrow, worn-down street. Small wooden houses stood side by side. Paint peeled from the walls. Front porches leaned with age. Children played barefoot in dusty yards. Daniel pointed quietly. "There." The Cadillac stopped in front of the smallest house on the block. Its roof sagged slightly. One window was covered with cardboard. The front steps creaked under every footstep. Daniel looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry." Elvis gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Never apologize for where you come from. The place you start doesn't decide where you'll finish." Daniel slowly opened the front door. "Mama?" "I brought someone." A weak voice answered from inside. "Who is it, sweetheart?" Daniel smiled through tears. "I don't think you're going to believe me." Elvis stepped into the tiny house. The room was humble. A worn sofa, an old wooden table, a shelf holding only a few plates. Near the window stood a small bed. A pale woman slowly sat up, her face marked by illness, but softened by kindness. She looked toward the doorway. Then she froze. Her eyes widened. She whispered in disbelief, "Elvis?" For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Elvis walked over, took her hand with both of his, and smiled. "It's an honor to meet the woman who raised such an extraordinary young man." At that moment, Daniel's mother quietly began to cry. Not because Elvis Presley had entered her home, but because for the very first time in many years, someone had looked beyond their poverty and seen their worth. As the evening sunlight poured through the cracked window, Elvis looked at Daniel, then at his mother, and in the silence of that tiny room, he made a promise that would soon astonish the entire country. A promise that would begin with only a few simple words and end by changing Daniel's future forever. Part 2 ends on another cliffhanger, setting up Part 3, where Elvis publicly announces his support for Daniel, mentors him through months of training, and brings him onto the stage before thousands of people for the emotional finale. The tiny house was silent. Only the ticking of an old kitchen clock could be heard. The evening sunlight spilled through the cracked window, painting golden lines across the worn wooden floor. Daniel sat quietly beside his mother, still unable to believe that Elvis Presley was sitting in their living room. Elvis looked around the small house. There was almost nothing inside. A table that had been repaired more than once, a bookshelf with only a few worn books, an old family photograph resting inside a cracked frame, and, in one corner, a stack of unpaid medical bills. He didn't need anyone to explain their situation. Life already had. Daniel's mother wiped away her tears. "I'm sorry you had to see us like this." Elvis gently smiled. "Ma'am, I don't see poverty. I see courage. I see a mother who refused to let life take away her son's kindness." She lowered her eyes. "No one has ever said that to me." Elvis reached into his jacket and carefully pulled out a folded piece of paper. His manager immediately recognized it. It was the schedule for the next several months. Sold-out concerts, television appearances, recording sessions, interviews. Millions of dollars already committed. Elvis looked at the paper for only a moment. Then, without saying a word, he folded it in half. And then again. Finally, he handed it back to his manager. "I'll rearrange everything." The manager stared at him. "Elvis, you mean a few dates?" Elvis slowly shook his head. "I mean all of it." The room became quiet again. He turned toward Daniel. "Tomorrow morning, I want you to come to Graceland." Daniel blinked. "Graceland? The real Graceland?" Elvis laughed softly. "I don't know another one." The boy looked completely overwhelmed. "But I don't have nice clothes. I've never had singing lessons. I don't even know how to read music." Elvis leaned forward. "Neither talent nor character is measured by expensive clothes." "You already have the hardest part." Daniel whispered. "What's that?" "A heart people believe." The next morning, long before sunrise, Daniel stood outside the gates of Graceland holding the same broken guitar. He almost turned around 3 different times. Every voice inside his head told him he didn't belong there. But another voice, the one Elvis had awakened the day before, kept telling him to take one more step. The gates slowly opened. An employee welcomed him inside with a warm smile. Everything felt unreal. Beautiful gardens, tall trees, music floating through open windows. For a boy who had spent years singing on sidewalks, it felt like another world. Inside one of the rehearsal rooms, Elvis was already waiting. Not dressed like a superstar, no stage clothes, no expensive jewelry. Just a simple shirt, blue jeans, and an acoustic guitar resting across his lap. He smiled. "You're early." Daniel nervously replied, "I didn't want to miss a single minute." Elvis nodded. "Good. Because dreams are built by people who arrive early." That morning became the beginning of a routine neither of them would ever forget. Every day, they practiced, sometimes for hours, sometimes until sunset. Elvis never treated Daniel like a charity case. He treated him like an artist. When Daniel sang beautifully, Elvis praised him. When he made mistakes, Elvis encouraged him to sing again. "If you're afraid to fail, you'll eventually become afraid to dream." Weeks turned into months. Daniel's confidence slowly replaced his fear. Professional vocal coaches helped strengthen his voice. Musicians taught him rhythm. Songwriters explained storytelling. But Elvis always reminded everyone of one thing: technique creates singers. Life creates artists. Whenever Daniel became discouraged, Elvis would tell him stories from his own childhood. How he had been rejected, how people laughed, how success had never arrived overnight. One afternoon, Daniel asked quietly, "Why are you doing all of this for me?" Elvis looked out the studio window for several moments. Finally, he answered, "When I was a little boy, someone believed in me before the world did. I promised myself, if I ever had the chance, I would become that person for someone else." Daniel never forgot those words. Nearly 1 year passed. The frightened child who once sang for spare change had changed. His voice had become stronger. His confidence had grown. But one thing never changed. Every rehearsal ended exactly the same way. Elvis would place a hand on Daniel's shoulder and say, "Never sing to impress people. Sing so one lonely person in the audience feels understood." Then came the night, the largest concert Memphis had seen that year. Thousands upon thousands of fans filled every seat. Spotlights swept across the arena. The excitement was electric. People had waited for hours just to hear Elvis perform. Backstage, Daniel stood silently. His hands shook. "I can't do this." Elvis smiled. "That's exactly what I said before one of my first shows." Daniel looked surprised. "You were nervous?" Elvis laughed. "Every single time. The day you stop feeling nervous is the day you stop caring." The announcer's voice echoed through the arena. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Elvis Presley!" The audience exploded. Thunderous applause shook the building. People screamed. Whistles echoed. Thousands stood to their feet. Elvis walked onto the stage. The lights followed him. He reached the microphone. The cheering continued for nearly a full minute. Everyone waited for the first song. Instead, Elvis remained silent. Slowly, the arena grew quiet. He looked across the sea of faces. Then he smiled. "A year ago, I walked out of a pharmacy expecting nothing more than an ordinary day. I thought people were waiting for my autograph. But God had something far greater waiting for me." The audience listened carefully. "I met a young boy who wasn't asking for fame. He wasn't asking for money. He was only trying to buy bread for his sick mother." Silence spread through the arena. I heard something in his voice that no recording studio can manufacture. I heard honesty. I heard courage. And I promised him, if he never stopped believing, neither would I. He turned toward the side of the stage, then spoke words no one expected. "Daniel, it's your turn." The curtains slowly opened. Daniel stepped into the light. For one brief second, everything disappeared. The crowd, the lights, the applause. All he could remember was sitting alone on a wooden crate with a broken guitar. Elvis walked over, placed that same familiar hand on Daniel's shoulder, then quietly whispered, "Sing from your heart. That's where people have been waiting to hear you all along." Daniel nodded. The music began. His first note floated through the arena, clear, powerful, honest. Within moments, thousands of people fell completely silent. Many wiped tears from their faces before the song had even reached the chorus. Some held each other's hands. Others simply closed their eyes. They weren't listening to perfection. They were listening to truth. When the final note faded, there was absolute silence. 1 heartbeat. 2 heartbeats. Then, the entire arena rose to its feet. A roar of applause erupted like thunder. People cried openly. Some shouted Daniel's name. Others simply kept clapping and clapping and clapping. The standing ovation seemed endless. Daniel looked toward Elvis with tears streaming down his face. "I couldn't have done this without you." Elvis gently shook his head. "Yes, you could. I only opened the door. You were the one brave enough to walk through it." Daniel embraced him. The audience applauded even louder. Many people later said it was one of the most emotional moments they had ever witnessed. Not because a superstar had performed, but because a superstar had chosen to lift someone else into the light. Years later, whenever Daniel was asked where his career truly began, he never mentioned the concert. He never mentioned Graceland. He never mentioned the standing ovation. He always smiled and gave the same answer. It began the moment one man stopped walking. Everyone else saw a poor boy asking for coins. Elvis Presley saw a dream waiting for someone to believe in it. And perhaps that was Elvis's greatest performance. Not the songs that topped the charts, not the concerts that filled arenas, not the records that broke every expectation, but the quiet decision to cross one busy street, kneel beside a forgotten child, and remind the world that the greatest gift we can give another person is not money, not fame, not success. It is belief. Because one sincere act of kindness, one moment of compassion, one person willing to stop and truly listen, can echo through generations. The crowd remembered the concert. Daniel remembered the words. But history remembered something even greater. On that ordinary morning in Memphis, the king of rock and roll didn't create another fan. He helped create another dream. And sometimes, that is the most beautiful song a person will ever leave behind.